Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into something super important for public servants, especially if you're looking to make a real difference for Indigenous people in Canada.
Oh, absolutely.
We're talking about access to information, but through a really specific lens.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah, we've got this government report all about feedback that they got directly from Indigenous peoples on the Access to Information Act. You probably know it as ATIA.
Right.
And get this. The report highlights some pretty significant challenges,
It does.
but it also, points to some really cool opportunities to make things better. So, get ready, because I think there's going to be some aha moments for everyone listening.
Definitely. Like, what really struck me when I was reading this report is how important it is for, us, like public servants, to really understand these different perspectives when we're talking about access to information.
Yeah.
It's not a one-size-fits-all situation at all.
Not at all, yeah.
And I think this report just, shines a light on that really effectively.
It does.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, it highlights three main themes that we're going to be unpacking today. So first, we're going to be talking about Indigenous data sovereignty.
Right.
Then we're going to move into their right of access to information.
Okay.
And then that third theme, the one that I think might get a little bit tricky, is the need to redefine Aboriginal government within the ATIA.
Right.
But before we even get into that, I'm already thinking about all these themes. And I'm like, okay, how's this going to, practically speaking, play out for us as public servants?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Right. So I think a good place to start is data sovereignty,
Totally.
because I feel like we hear that phrase being thrown around a lot. But what does it actually mean?
Yeah, so you hear it everywhere nowadays, right? But it's more than just a buzzword. It's a really important concept.
Right.
It's about Indigenous peoples having the right to govern the data that's being collected about them. You can kind of think about it as self-determination, but applied to the digital world.
Yeah.
All that data and information that's out there.
Yeah, that makes total sense. It's like we wouldn't dream of telling a community how to run their local election.
Exactly.
So why should data be any different?
Exactly, yeah.
Right.
And the report actually brings up the First Nations Information Governance Center,
Okay.
the FNIGC.
FNIGC.
Yeah, and they have a really powerful stance on this. They actually see data sovereignty as a key part of self-government.
Whoa, okay. That puts a whole other lens on it.
Yeah.
Right, because if we're saying, we as public servants truly want to support self-determination,
Yeah,
well, then we need to respect their data sovereignty. That's just non-negotiable.
absolutely.
Right.
And actually, the report even goes on to call for specific support for Indigenous-led data governance strategies
Okay.
and capacity-building initiatives. So it's not about imposing our systems on them.
Right.
It's about empowering them to develop their own approaches that work for them.
Exactly, yeah. Okay, but here's where I feel like it gets a little sticky.
Yeah.
Because the report also brings up the fact that sometimes the government collects way too much data
Right.
on Indigenous peoples.
Right.
How does that work with data sovereignty? That seems kind of counterproductive.
Yeah, it is. And actually, the FNIGC recommends trying to find a balance between, data collection
Right.
and public interest, but considering each community's context.
Right.
It's not just a one-size-fits-all approach. It's
Yeah.
really about looking at each community and understanding their specific needs.
Yeah. So, as public servants, that has huge implications for how we even design programs and policies.
Mhm.
Are we actually incorporating these data sovereignty principles?
Yeah,
When we're consulting with communities and when we're collecting data?
right.
And are we making sure that the data is being used ethically and responsibly? This report is really making me think.
It is. And that's, I think, a really important point because, there's one example that comes up in the report that, it really highlights this tension really well.
Okay.
And it's this case study involving the Metis Nation and census data.
Okay.
So the government, relies on self-identification for the census, right?
All right.
But that might not actually align with how the Metis Nation determines citizenship. So it's kind of a clash.
So the data that we're collecting might not even be accurate.
Exactly.
Here, the realities of these communities.
It might not reflect their own understanding of who they are.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a lot to unpack. So should we move on to that second theme now?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Indigenous people's right of access to information that the government holds. So this seems pretty straightforward, but something tells me it's a little bit more complicated.
You're right, there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. So basically, this right is about making sure that Indigenous peoples can actually access records, that they get them in a timely manner, and that the information is actually relevant to them.
Yeah.
And they need this access for a whole bunch of different reasons. Things like settling land claims, making informed decisions for their communities, tracing their genealogy,
Right.
even preserving their cultural heritage. It's a wide range, really.
So this is really fundamental for them to, like, exercise their rights,
Absolute.
make decisions about their own future. It seems like it should be easy to access this information. Like, it's a no-brainer,
It
right?
seems like it should be, but unfortunately, it's not always the case.
Oh, okay.
The report paints a really kind of frustrating picture, to be honest. Like, there are a lot of delays, and the quality of the records is sometimes really poor.
Hmm.
Imagine trying to, like, assert your rights or make decisions for your community,
Yeah.
and the records you need are incomplete, or it takes forever to even get a hold of them.
Yeah, it's so disheartening.
It is.
The report even mentioned the National Claims Research Directors in CRD, and they had some pretty, like, pointed feedback on this.
Yeah, they did. They actually went as far as to suggest that maybe Library and Archives Canada, LAC, might be a better place to house those records
Wow.
than government departments.
They said that. Wow. What makes them think that? Like, what makes LAC a better fit?
Well, they argued that LAC has a much simpler access process for the public
Okay.
and that they have better facilities for preserving these documents,
Right.
which, are often really delicate and historically significant.
Yeah.
I mean, they're the experts in maintaining records, right?
Yeah. And that says a lot about the frustration around this,
It does.
right? Like, as public servants, we need to ask ourselves, how can we do better? Like, what can we advocate for within our own departments to improve resources and training in our ATIP offices?
Yeah, that's a crucial question. Like, maybe we need to push for more funding so we can improve our record management systems.
Right.
Or maybe we need to advocate for more mandatory training for our ATIP staff, especially training that focuses on the needs of Indigenous communities. Even small steps, can make a difference.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, let's get into that third key theme.
Okay.
The definition of Aboriginal government within the ATI. This one I feel like is where it gets really complex.
It does. It might seem like a small technical detail, but it's really not. It actually has huge implications for Indigenous governance. And the report points out that the current definition is really, really narrow.
Okay, so like, how narrow are we talking here?
Well, it only includes 9 First Nations governments and councils, plus band councils as defined by the Indian Act.
Hold on, so countless Indigenous governments and organizations are just left out of that definition.
Yeah,
That seems like a huge oversight.
it is. And it actually creates this really concerning situation
Mm-hmm.
because those governments that are excluded, they don't have the same information protections
Okay.
as federal, provincial, or even municipal governments.
So, like, sensitive information that's shared with the federal government by these Indigenous governments wouldn't be protected in the same way.
Exactly.
That seems like a disaster waiting to happen.
Yeah.
Like, imagine if your municipal government couldn't protect sensitive information.
Right. It would be chaos.
Yeah.
And it just really shows you how systemic barriers can be embedded in our laws and policies,
Right.
even if it wasn't intentional.
Yeah.
And I think this is exactly where we as public servants have this responsibility to push for change.
And that's what we're going to be diving into in part 2 of this deep dive.
Right.
We'll be exploring some potential solutions and discussing how we, as public servants, can advocate for a system that's more inclusive and more just for Indigenous communities.
Mm.
So stay
Yeah.
tuned.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Welcome back, everyone. We're picking up right where we left off, still digging into access to information and Indigenous governance in Canada. We were talking about how the definition of Aboriginal government in the ATII is, like, way too narrow.
Yeah, it's a big problem. So many Indigenous governments are just left out, and they don't get those same information protections that other levels of government have.
It's almost like we're saying they're not real governments, which is just wrong. It's kind of wild when you think about it, right? It's like technical definition in a law
Yeah.
actually having such real consequences.
Definitely. It really highlights why we need to understand this stuff and why we need to advocate for change. Like, it's not enough to just say, well, that's the law. We need to be doing something about it.
Totally. So let's talk solutions. What can we actually do?
Well, I always say knowledge is power, right? So first, we need to make sure we're informed. We need to be those advocates in our departments. Talk about this issue, share the report with colleagues, maybe even like suggest policy changes.
I feel like sometimes we forget how much power we have, even in our own little corners of the public service.
Hmm.
Like just by starting conversations, we can actually spark change.
Exactly. And we can also support those efforts that Indigenous organizations are already leading, amplify their voices, go to events, help with research. There's so much we can do.
I like that. So we're talking internal advocacy within our departments and also supporting Indigenous-led initiatives.
Exactly.
Okay, so zooming out for a sec, like big picture, why should access to information be like a top priority for us as public servants?
Well, I mean, it's tied to reconciliation, right?
Yeah.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, like they put so much emphasis on information sharing and respecting Indigenous governance. We can't have true reconciliation without fair access to information.
It's about rebuilding trust and making things right after all that historical injustice. And it's about supporting Indigenous self-determination.
Absolutely.
It's not just the right thing to do. It's like essential for good governance for everyone.
Imagine trying to make decisions about your future when you can't even access basic information. It's impossible. When Indigenous communities have the information they need, they can actually, chart their own course, make their own
Right.
choices.
It's not just about fixing the past. It's about empowering them to build a good future.
Yeah.
And when they can do that, it benefits everyone in Canada.
For sure. Think about it. When you have well-informed communities, you get better healthcare, education, economic development, even better environmental protection. The list goes on. When Indigenous communities are doing well, Canada does well.
I like that way of looking at it. It's not us versus them. It's about recognizing that we're all in this together and making sure Indigenous communities have the same opportunities as everyone else.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, before we move on, I wanted to touch on something we mentioned before, those Indigenous knowledge systems.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? We've been talking so much about government information, but Indigenous communities have their own ways of governing information that have existed for a really long time.
It's like all this knowledge isn't just sitting in government files. There's so much knowledge within these communities that we need to recognize.
For sure. The report doesn't get into it too much, but it asks this really interesting question.
What's that?
Could we figure out ways to bring those Indigenous knowledge systems into our work as public servants?
Oh, wow.
Could we blend those approaches with Western ways of managing information?
That would be amazing.
Yeah.
Like seeing problems through a different lens, changing how we develop policies, how we work with communities. But we have to remember, it's not about just absorbing their knowledge into our existing systems.
Yeah.
It's about supporting their own initiatives, too.
Absolutely. We need to go way beyond just checking a box and saying we consulted. We need real partnerships where Indigenous voices are actually leading the way. And to do that, we need to be humble, be willing to learn, and really respect their ways of knowing.
That's a good point. I
Yeah.
think that's a great place to pause for now. Yeah. When we come back, we'll wrap things up and talk about how you, as a public servant, can take all of this and actually make a difference. Okay, so we're back for the final part of this deep dive. We've talked a lot about the challenges in the big picture, but now it's time for action. What can public servants actually do to be better allies on this access to information front?
I think that's the question we all have, right? How can we make a difference? The good news is, even small steps can have a big impact. Change takes time, but we can make a more just system if we keep pushing for it.
Okay, so let's get practical. What are some specific things people can do?
Well, it starts with education. The report we talked about is a great starting point.
Right.
But there's so much more to learn. Find Indigenous organizations in your area. Maybe go to a workshop about data sovereignty. The more we know, the more we can help.
Yeah, knowledge is power, but we have to use that knowledge. It's not enough to just learn about it. We have to become allies and actually do something.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to ask questions, Learn from Indigenous experts. Be humble. We're not here to save the day. We're here to learn.
I like that. So learning is key. But while we're doing that, we can also start making changes in our own departments, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Even small things like talking to coworkers about this,
Yeah.
sharing what we've learned, maybe even suggesting changes to policies.
Yeah, internal advocacy is important.
Hmm.
We often have more influence than we realize, and all those little changes can make a big difference over time. And if you're someone who works on policy or programs, think about how you can include Indigenous data sovereignty in your work from the start. Talk to Indigenous communities, make sure their voices are shaping things.
It's not just about checking a box that says we consulted. It's about truly working together.
Right. And even if you don't work directly on policy, there are so many things you can do. Maybe push for more funding for ATIP offices, better training for staff, help protect and digitize Indigenous records, use respectful language when working with communities.
All good points. And this isn't just about following rules, it's about building good relationships built on respect and trust.
Yeah, it's about acknowledging those past harms and working together to make things better for everyone.
It's about action, not just words. So, as we wrap up, we challenge everyone listening, what can you do? No matter how small, keep learning, keep speaking up, keep pushing for change.
Yeah. And remember, you're not alone in this. There are lots of us working towards this. By working together, we can really make a difference for Indigenous peoples and for Canada. Thanks for listening.